G'day everybody, my name is Jeremy Lord. I am a professional artist and illustrator based in Sydney. It's a new year, 2026 is now started well and truly, and everybody's kind of looking at new projects, new things coming online. I myself am looking at revamping my portfolio, revisiting old pieces, finding new clients, bringing kind of new jobs, thinking of where I'm going to go. And so in that kind of respect, I thought I would take this occasion to partner up with Adobe and bring you a 4-part series on basically everything you need to know to kickstart your illustration career in 2026. So these 4 videos are going to be under the running kind of guide rail of a specific brief that I've given myself. I've prepared this work earlier, and this is a self-brief. I like to play video games. I obviously like to do a lot of illustration. A lot of my clients are in the video game industry. And so we'll go into a lot more depth into that in this first video, in the second video. But what I thought I'd show you guys is kind of how you can go about kind of doing this and showcasing it in a super professional way and getting a nice portfolio piece. That's the point of these 4 videos, is getting you to a spot where you basically have a really nice project that you can showcase to different clients and hopefully get some jobs on the back of it. Okay, so I thought I'd kick us off by kind of running through what each video is going to look like, and you can kind of see the beginning to end kind of focus of this 4-part series. So the first video, obviously, we're going to talk about which apps to choose. We're going to focus on 3 apps. We've got Adobe Photoshop, Adobe Illustrator, and Adobe Fresco. Each do kind of different things to be used in different contexts. We're going to take a look at that today. The second video will be a little bit more centric around kind of getting onto the tools. So we'll start with Photoshop. It's probably the most basic, most approachable program, I guess. So we'll get into some basics of that, canvas sizes, raster versus vector graphics, simple kind of layers, simple workflows and sketching and all that in Photoshop. Third video, we'll get a little bit more advanced, looking at working what we call kind of non-destructively and setting up a sustainable workflow going forward in your career as well, working with clients that are likely to make changes, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, the 4th video, we'll be looking at what we kind of spoke about before, which is getting something like this, getting this project, this final kind of, showcase piece to put into your portfolio and hopefully to pitch to clients. And so that's the core kind of structure of these first 4 videos that we're kind of looking at today. All right, so let's get into this. So why start with Photoshop? So Photoshop is probably your most kind of lowest barrier to entry app that you will use as a digital illustrator. It's probably the most common one, the one that most professionals will use at some stage in their workflow. I'd say it's probably the one that's the most kind of like, hey, you want to do some digital sketching or drawing? Start with Photoshop. Then we'll look at Illustrator. It's a little bit more kind of case specific. It's a little bit more complicated, different things to use. And then finally, we'll look at Fresco. That's kind of a good crossover in between Photoshop and Illustrator. So let's open up Photoshop and get this party started. So this is Photoshop. I've opened up a kind of a new canvas in here. We'll talk about kind of details on how to do that in the next video, video number 2. So I won't be showing you guys any kind of necessary kind of tips and tricks here. The point of today's video is a little bit more about like, what can this thing do? What should you use it for and why? So basically Photoshop looks like this. We've got layers, we've got brushes, and we can do kind of a bunch of different things. So effectively what we're looking at is something like this, right? I got a brush, I got some color, and I can start to draw. Now, before we get too far into this, if you're looking at becoming a digital illustrator, you're probably going to need to invest in some kind of drawing tablet. You do not want to be using a mouse for your digital art. Generally speaking, it's not necessarily going to be something that's going to work well for you. Some people do, depending on what you're doing. You could do pixel art with all that, with a mouse and stuff. But generally speaking, you're probably going to want something that's going to allow you to use a stylus, so basically a pencil, to draw as a mouse. And so there's a bunch of different options for drawing tablets, as you can see here. Which one you choose is probably the topic for another bunch of videos. But that's what I'm using, and it incorporates into a bunch of different features in Photoshop. So first and foremost, like I said, we are just getting in here and we're just kind of getting into some drawing, right? So we can really start to do some cool stuff here with our kind of brush and really just kind of doodle and sketch away as we need to, right? So that's the basic kind of core foundation of Photoshop. It's great for kind of like, I guess, sketching. It feels like you're drawing. It feels like painting. There's a huge amount of different brushes that are available to you in Photoshop. They're all going to be doing something in particular. I'm using this very, very basic kind of core brush that's there, but you could use a bunch of different ones. But where the stylus will come into play, obviously, aside from the comfort of being able to kind of draw with your hand and a pen rather than a mouse, is if I'm using my mouse to draw, you'll notice that I'm going to get only a certain amount of thickness and a certain kind of line weight, if you will. It's going to be pure black and just round all the way through, because that's the brush tip that I'm using. I'm using this round brush. But with one of these, we've got pressure sensitivity. And so Photoshop can get something going where we end up pressing very lightly, so it's a light brush. And then if I press down harder, I've got something darker and thicker, and I can vary that. So effectively, Photoshop will allow me to do something like this, right? Where I've got these kind of sketches, and these are the sketches that I will have started for the project that I was showing you guys earlier. And they're all completely digital. A little bit, potentially, sadly, I've kind of foregone any kind of sketch on paper. I'm trying to potentially get back into it this year, but the convenience of kind of digital sketching is just huge. Absolutely, fantastic for doing all this kind of stuff. Doing edits, making kind of changes, making copies, all of that kind of thing is really good for kind of professional work. And Photoshop works super well in that respect for creating this. So if we're looking at something a little bit more advanced, right? Because obviously sketching, whoop-de-doo, you might want to kind of go a little bit further than that. There's a bunch of different things that are available to you. So this is the kind of the line art with the sketch that I have created for this piece. And then we're adding some colors into it. We can add some shading, some highlights and all this kind of stuff. So all of this is done in Photoshop using a range of different brushes. The one kind of, I guess, drawback of Photoshop, and the one sort of, I guess, main reason why potentially you shouldn't use it for professional work, is it uses what we call raster graphics. So this is a huge thing for the industry and for professional artists and photographers alike. Probably more so graphic designers and illustrators. The difference in between a raster graphic and a vector graphic, which is what Illustrator outputs and uses. So raster graphic uses pixels. So if I zoom in on this really, really, really far, you'll start to see these kind of pixels come up. You'll start to see, each individual pixel happening in here, and this affects the resolution of my image. So raster images are very easy to manipulate. I can do loads and loads of different things to this in Photoshop, quite simply, without too much kind of hassle. I can really start to add in a lot of detail, clip layers to each other, kind of hide stuff, showcase things, other different things coming in and all that. I can really get a lot of detail pumping through in Photoshop very, very, very quickly. But if I go to my image size, you'll see at the moment I'm in pixels, but if I go into my actual physical dimensions, this is an I'm going to say something stupid, an A2, right? So 420 by 594 is an A2. That means this file will only ever be able to be printed at that size maximum without starting to lose a resolution, right? If my client, for instance, knew that they wanted to print this like on the side of a 4-story building, this would be problematic. I would have to work on something that would be a little bit bigger. The issue here is if I really, really upscale this too much, you'll notice, like, let's grab all of this, we'll duplicate that and smash it into one layer. If I start to grow this and kind of scale it up, what you'll notice is I'm getting some really horrible resolution issues with that. So if I snap back that back down to actual size and go in at that, you see that it's clear, it's crisp, it's working the way that it's intended to work. But if I scale it up, I'm going to start losing resolution. It's going to print horribly. That's a problem. So the vast majority of work that you will have to do with a client will need to be handed in as a vector file. And one of the things that Photoshop can't really do, and using these kind of raster brushes, is specifically that. So you might say, oh, well, Jeremy, why are you telling us to use Photoshop as a kind of a entry-level thing if almost no client will accept a vector file? Well, it's not necessarily true that that's the case, right? If you're working for digital, right? So if you're working only for screens, if you're creating concept art for video games, if you're creating icons for web, if you're, doing things that are going to only ever be produced on screen, then you can work potentially with that. The trade-off with this is I've done this a bunch of different times with clients where I prefer to work in Photoshop over Illustrator. I just find that the workflow feels a lot more natural. It feels a lot more like drawing and painting. It's a lot cleaner in that way. So I, as much as possible, try and kind of convince clients to be able to work in Photoshop. What happens with that in mind then is if I have to work at a much higher resolution or file size than I think I might potentially need. So this is for a video game box art. I know that's probably only going to be like 20 centimeters by 15. I don't need it to be this gigantic size of 40 by almost 600. That's overkill. I'm making too much of a file size and potentially weighing down the file. But it's just in case the client decides, actually, you know what, let's put this on a A2 poster, or let's print this on a t-shirt. I won't have to redraw anything. So Photoshop, really great for, entry-level sketching, really great for, getting that kind of hands-on feeling. If you're transitioning from, working with pencils, brushes, markers, inks on paper, this will be really kind of like, it'll feel really familiar to you. Working with a drawing tablet in Photoshop and a basic brush will feel just like sketching. So that's why I kind of put this forward as the kind of most entry level kind of thing, lowest barrier to entry with that. But downside is only raster output. And so a lot of clients will potentially need some convincing. And usually I'd say probably about sort of 85% of the time, you are going to be looking at handing in a vector file to a client. There are ways around this, and we'll take a look at that when we get into Illustrator, which is the next part of our video. Okay, so this is Adobe Illustrator. Looks quite similar in a lot of ways to Photoshop. We got the same kind of window setup. We got a bunch of different tools all around the place, depending on what I've kind of been using. One of the key things actually I should mention before I go ahead with this is we're talking about all these different programs, and you can see, there's a lot happening on this screen. There's tools everywhere, there's menus, and there's sub-menus within menus, and there's just a whole lot going on. One of the key things I think to remember when you're getting into this, to avoid getting kind of discouraged and intimidating right out the door, is you don't need to know every single thing here. Photoshop in particular is quite versatile. It's one of the things that makes it really interesting for a lot of people to use. It's great for photographers. It's great for digital artists. There's a bunch of different things that you could do there. So I'm pretty well versed in Photoshop when it comes to digital art and kind of handling layers and brushes and kind of making illustrations. I wouldn't know the first thing about using Camera Raw and editing kind of filters and all that as a photographer would, and probably vice versa. So you don't need to know everything that goes on here. So don't necessarily be too intimidated right off the gate. It's like, oh man, I need to know all this stuff. Not the case. All right. So Illustrator, similar kind of setup. We've also got layers, works a little bit differently to what we looked at. So Illustrator also has a bunch of brushes. So you can potentially draw in Illustrator. So let me grab a different color here and grab some black, and I've got my brush and I can make marks. So one of the first things that you'll notice here is I don't have this opacity shift that I had in Photoshop. That has nothing to do with my brush. There aren't a ton of brushes in Photoshop, in Illustrator. Or there are, but not in the same way as what they work as in Photoshop, right? So I don't have this kind of opacity shift for kind of sketching. I don't necessarily have the same control over the texture, but I can sketch and kind of draw or ink things in Illustrator if I need to. And I do have a certain amount of pressure sensitivity applied to this as well, again, using my stylus with my drawing tablet. Right? If I was using a mouse, none of this would be possible. It would just kind of be nice and thick. So already we're kind of seeing one of the kind of drawbacks to kind of sketching in Illustrator. Most people would never think about sketching in Illustrator. You'd bring in your raster sketch as a kind of a JPEG in Illustrator and then kind of draw over it if you needed to, right? And just kind of ink it up as a vector. One of the really kind of interesting things that you'll notice with this is I've got all these little kind of points here. These are known as anchor points, and they're all kind of editable. So this is the difference in between raster graphics and vector graphics. If I switch back into Photoshop and open up my file here, I'm going to create some type in here. And we're going to swap to, let's go with an Adobe font. Go. And that will do just fine. So if I zoom in on this, you'll notice I'll start to see some pixels, right? This is raster graphics. If I do the same thing in Illustrator using the same font, right? So we're going to use the same font, same text, and we're going to increase the size of this a little bit. What you'll notice is that no matter how much I zoom in, I'm not getting any pixelation. This is a raster graphic. So let me just show you guys how that works. So raster graphics, basically where Photoshop is looking at this in terms of like, how can I put this? It's just kind of filling in pixels one by one. It's effectively pixel art at a super, super high resolution, right? And like I said, if I zoom in, we can see those pixels and we can see that kind of smoothing down, that kind of grayscale shift that we've got going on up here. But in Illustrator, what it's doing is it's kind of using mathematics. Now, that might sound a little bit kind of not super creative and not super intuitive, but it's putting anchor points. So these guys are known as anchor points, right? It's putting an anchor point down and it's calculating a trajectory in between those two anchor points. And it's making that really, really, really smooth and very crisp. So vector graphics basically have no size concern. It's the main reason why almost all of your clients will ask you for vector graphics, because it just means that no matter how we change the brief, no matter how we kind of think about like, oh, we wanted to do this promo on the thing and we've got our logo is made in Photoshop, but we wanted to print on, you know, the size of the Empire State Building or whatever, we can't do that because that raster file won't stretch that high. We'll have to rebuild the file from scratch at that resolution. With vector graphics, it doesn't matter. You could make something that is super, super, super small, like literally really, really tiny on your screen, and hand that over to your client at that size. And this would be able to be printed, you know, across the entire surface of the sun if you wanted to. Like, it can just be huge. This is infinitely scalable, which is what we kind of talk about when we talk about graphics. Vector graphics is this idea of scalability. So it's just one of those things that clients will just always gravitate to. However, like I said, not great for more kind of painterly things if you're looking for this kind of like a texture to happen in your work, right? So let's pick a kind of a slightly fancier brush, one that's going to kind of work in a little bit more color. So let's go in with like a blue. And again, we're in Photoshop here. And I'm going to paint across this. You'll get some nice kind of crossovers when I flip to a different color. So let's go with like a pink. And you'll notice there's a kind of effectively this kind of charcoal pastel-y mix that happens. We're getting this kind of purple, you know, overtone that happens because the blue is mixing with that purple. And so there's a hell of a lot of brushes in Photoshop that will do that. That is not possible to do in Illustrator. So almost all of the digital paintings that you'll see for concept art, matte painting, movies, all that kind of stuff will be done in Photoshop or another kind of raster program, not in Illustrator. Illustrator is an image building tool. So if we come back to our project file that we've been working on in Photoshop, you'll notice there's a bunch of different things that are happening in here, right? So I'm going to go back into here. I'm going to show you guys the mock-up that we've got. So the cover here is done in Photoshop, but the wheel I did in Illustrator. So Illustrator, the strengths of Illustrator is for image building, sort of like symbols, shapes, all that kind of stuff. So where in Photoshop, I would have to create a lot of kind of very perfect circles to work with and kind of duplicate those to create this kind of skateboard wheel that I used as a base for my kind of CD, DVD kind of cover. This would be quite tricky to do in Photoshop. It would take me a lot of time. Not impossible, but not really the best way, the best practice to work in as we're kind of going for this. So this is really nice to do this sort of stuff, this more kind of symbol or graphic design or logos or anything like that. Logos are almost always done in Illustrator or a vector kind of program like that because infinitely scalable, a lot more kind of easy to edit, shapes and those kinds of things, and simple graphics like this are great to create in Photoshop, in Illustrator, right? So we've got these kind of shape tools that we can use in Illustrator that allow us to create a variety of different shapes that we can really start to use and kind of put together to create this. But like I said, often can feel a little bit weird to use for beginners. One of the main kind of tools here is this pen tool that I was using that you saw me kind of dragging these funky lines across, right? And it's kind of creating shapes like this. This is not really drawing. There are absolutely drawing tools in Illustrator that you can try and use if you want to. But again, variety, nuance, it won't necessarily feel like drawing or painting as much as you might kind of want. However, again, completely possible to create this. So here what I've done is I've created the rings of this wheel are all, you know, vector shapes, very easy to kind of create. But then these graphics, I've just gone and used a basic brush to create those. And they are all absolutely vector graphics. As you can see, I've got all those kind of anchor points, and this is infinitely scalable. So again, possible to do this in Photoshop, better to do this in Illustrator. Vector graphics just really work well when you're working with print, but have certain drawbacks as well. So that's Illustrator in a kind of a nutshell, and where you would use Illustrator. Logos, simple graphics, anything that you need to kind of create with typography is usually a lot better to do in Illustrator. You can bring all those things into Photoshop afterwards. They will obviously become rasters. They will no longer be vectors. But that's one of the ways that you can work with as well. So let's go on to our third and final app, which is Adobe Fresco, which is a nice kind of crossover in between the two. All right, so now finally we are in Adobe Fresco. So you can see I'm on my iPad. I'm using a stylus again for all of this. So like Photoshop, this is basically kind of want to think about Fresco, like it's kind of like Photoshop Lite, but also really good crossover in between Photoshop and Illustrator. Mostly because we've got a really awesome feature in our brushes. So you can see it's got a lot of the same kind of tools and elements as Photoshop does. But in all of our brushes, you can see we've got pixel brushes, live brushes, and then finally we got vector brushes. So these vector brushes, there's not vector available for all types of brushes. Like I said, this kind of opacity shift that you get, all these kind of gradients, that's only available to use on non-vector brushes, or like just pixel brushes, which is Fresco's kind of terminology for raster brushes, or live brushes. But vector brushes work in a kind of a really nice way. So let's start with our pixel brushes. So our pixel brushes, again, you can see we've got a ton of different really cool things happening in here. We can start to kind of draw with our stylus. We got lots of really kind of like pencil-y looking kind of brushes, can get some really nice kind of gradients happening, will feel very kind of textury and very nice to use, as if it was, yeah, effectively kind of pencil or charcoal on something like this. We've got, again, in here, we've got a ton of different kind of, we've got some painting brushes in here, so we can use like a canvas flat brush. So that's going to give us, you know, a little bit of that canvas texture that you can see. And if we mix the colors a little bit, we'll start to see some interesting results with this. So we got some paint, and then we come in with like a pink, and you can see again, it is kind of mixing those two a little bit. So there's some really nice options that you could do. And we've got a smudge tool. If you're looking for something really painterly, we can really kind of smudge this around and get that looking really kind of quite nice for us. So yeah, so we've got a bunch of different options available to us in Fresco. It's probably one of my favorite ones for experimental kind of brushes. Some really, really nice things in here that you can do, particularly if you're looking at what is called live brushes. So live brushes work in a way that's kind of like, let me add a new layer and then we'll hide this one so we can kind of start clean. Live brushes are effectively kind of brushes that are kind of living brushes, if you will. So think like watercolor or wet paint, where the paint will stay wet regardless of what you do. So here we go. We got kind of like a watercolory thing, and you can see it's kind of like still continuing to bleed, even though I'm not kind of touching it. I'm not actually kind of drawing anything more on here, and it's still kind of like spreading as if it was watercolor, right? So I can do this, and you can see it's kind of like I dropped a drop of ink in there. That's really, really cool and really kind of fun to do. Obviously, again, this is all completely raster brushes, but really nice if you're looking to kind of mess around, you know, if you're doing like children's book illustrations, or if you're doing this kind of digital work that requires a little bit more texture, a little bit more kind of, you know, traditional feel. Like this watercolor is really, really powerful. It's probably the best watercolor brush in terms of digital that's out there, because of how it, you know, still kind of works. And you can see that really kind of cool effect of the blue really bleeding in, and it kind of pushes the pink out as I'm kind of drawing. It's really nice to work with. So there's a ton of live brushes in here as well. Some really nice options to be using in there. But the real kind of kicker for you guys working potentially, you know, as digital illustrators and maybe kind of creating vector art is we've also got this idea of vector brushes. So vector brushes, when I'm kind of working with them, let's go and pick a vector brush, and we'll go in and pick this kind of taper or this round kind of brush. There's a bunch of different brushes in here, but you'll notice that none of them have this texture that the live brushes and pixel brushes use. They're all flat colors, right? Again, that's because we can't really work in that way when we're working with vectors. It just doesn't get the kind of gradient thing. Each pixel is their own color. We're not using pixels, therefore we can't do the same kind of thing. So let's go with a simple brush. We got the round brush, and we can start to kind of draw. And this is going to get a little bit more kind of responsivity, I guess, sorry, than Photoshop would. Than Illustrator would. We're getting a little bit more kind of reactivity. It feels very much like, you know, drawing in Photoshop. The nice thing is that all of this is vector. Right? So if I draw, like, I don't know, let's say I'm going to draw a little kind of skull and crossbones, right? So I'm going to draw this kind of cool thing, and we're going to come back in here, and we're going to add some, you know, some sketchiness to this. Can really kind of work in a little bit more kind of like ink sketchy kind of feel to this and scratch it up. Here we go. Like so. So that's our kind of drawing there, but this is all completely vector. So if I kind of set this up in a way that's going to work well, again, not doing necessarily kind of a tutorial here on how to use Fresco, but I could come in then with different colors, and I could fill this in really, really quickly using that kind of layer to kind of boot that color into it a little bit. The nice thing about this, like I said, is no matter how much I pinch and zoom into this, the line stays really crisp and clean because we are using vector brushes. If I swap back to a different layer, I'm going to swap back to a pixel brush and choose a kind of like an inking brush like this. So let's go back to our blue, and you can see the difference in between. Sorry. That is now pixelated. Right? We're not getting that clean edge that the raster the raster gets this pixel, the vector gets this really nice kind of clean line. So you might be kind of asking then, all right, well then why wouldn't we just use Fresco only if, you know, clients are always going to ask us for vector artwork, and Fresco works really, really well with kind of creating that? Well, the downside to this is, like I said, is it's Photoshop. It's kind of a light version of these apps. It's pretty rare that you would be able to then kind of just share this file as is straight to a client. You'd probably want to bring this into Illustrator or Photoshop, depending on what you're kind of doing. It has a really cool feature up here where you can actually open a copy of this in Illustrator either for your iPad or for your desktop. But that is almost certainly going to be something that you're going to need to do as a last step once you're finished here, is take this into one of those programs that have a lot more options, a lot more control once the artwork is created in here. The other drawback is, like I said, if you want to use Fresco, it's only on iPad or other devices. It doesn't exist for desktop. Because of how it works, because of the gestures, because of all these kind of different things, you will need an extra device if you, on top of your computer, if you want to use Fresco. So that's potentially a downside to it. On the plus side is it's actually free. Fresco is free. If you have a Creative Cloud kind of account, you don't actually need to pay the monthly subscription for using Fresco only, unlike almost every other app in the Adobe suite. So that's a really nice kind of entry level kind of thing for students, for first timers, if you're kind of not looking into, you know, outlaying a whole heap of different money into it. Fresco being free is quite nice. But like I said, it's not really kind of a standalone app. You will likely need a, you know, quote unquote real app to finish this off and send it off to a client in a format and in a file kind of setup that's going to be appropriate for those clients. But that's effectively Fresco. It's a nice kind of in-between program, nice to kind of experiment with, and nice to be able to draw in vectors without kind of sacrificing too much there. Okay, so that about wraps it up for our little kind of showcase of, you know, choosing your app, choosing your weapon. It's like a video game kind of thing, you know, all your classes, they have some strengths, some weaknesses. some things that they're really good for, others that they would not be so kind of wise a choice to do. At the end of the day, you know, it's really up to you and how you kind of feel. I get this a lot of the time when I'm working. A lot of people see my art and it's like, oh, you're working all in Adobe Illustrator. I just prefer the way it Photoshop works. And then I just take my artwork into Illustrator and vectorize it to hand into clients who require vector files. So I'm using a kind of a mix of both, but effectively kind of, you know, do what you feel is right for you. But I just wanted to give you guys a quick intro, quick little tour of what app does what. So let's recap that really quickly. First up, we can either do the entire artwork in Adobe Photoshop from start to finish. So literally just work only in Adobe Photoshop. That's really good. Feels a lot more like drawing and painting. It's very flexible, and versatile, super beginner friendly. But like I said, the likelihood of you having to kind of rework that file or the client not being happy with it because it's a raster file, not a vector file, is pretty high on most commercial illustration jobs, especially if you're working in branding and packaging, and for the print industry, that's quite likely. Option number 2 is do everything in Illustrator. So obviously that's going to be really good for all your client work, fully scalable, it's vector, typographic work, logo work, all the kind of graphic shapes and everything like that, quite simple stuff, is going to be fantastic to work in with Illustrator. The downside is for beginners, working with vectors can feel very frustrating. Very much not like drawing and painting that you're used to if you're coming from traditional mediums to digital mediums. Really doesn't kind of feel like drawing. It's an image building program. It's not really for drawing. Option number 3 is do the entire work in Fresco. And then you can kind of create vector work that way. That's all good. It's on par with Photoshop for sketching. Some of the brushes are fantastic, as we saw, live brushes, vector brushes, heaps and heaps of different kind of tools to experiment with. Really fun to work with. It's simpler, kind of a light version of Photoshop, so very kind of beginner friendly for that. Like I said, downsides of this is only available on iPad and other mobile devices, so not available on desktop. And it's not really kind of an end program, if you will. It's a good program to use in conjunction with another program, not really a kind of standalone for most kind of client work, I would say. So what most people do is they use a combination of the two. Either they'll use Photoshop in Illustrator, or Illustrator in Fresco, or Fresco in Photoshop. Using a kind of combination of the two means you're going to use the tools that are across all of those different things. It opens up a whole bunch of different options for you, and really kind of allows your workflow to grow and be sustainable going forward into, you know, any kind of job that you might get. Clients will have different variety of jobs that they might do. So having that ability to work across different platforms is going to be really helpful for you. That's it. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We got 3 more videos going. So next video will be all about kind of getting into, creating a brief. All these apps are fantastic. They really expand your workflow. But if you don't really have a clear direction, you're kind of going to get nowhere fast. So having a good brief, finding good inspiration, getting the engine going is great. Having a steering wheel to kind of steer that engine and power through those briefs is going to be super handy as well. And that's what we'll cover in the next video. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys tune in.